Well, hi again. I sent back your grades yesterday. Um, I guess the one important comment I have is that well, the grades in general were very strong, um, and most of you chose to do the first question on the geopolitical context of the war, the Vietnam War, and I single out that question because many of you wrote good essays on that, and of course, part of it was based on the fact that I went over the question and carefully gave you the context. But in fact, many of you really surpassed what I had to say, and it was very well organized and showed us kind of strong intellectual understanding of really what was at stake, what was in question. And the reason I'm mentioning that is that this really is the way I ideally want your final essays to be. That is to say, to have a strong sort of intellectual conception and that becomes a kind of foundation for the discussion of the different books. And that's what I'm looking for. This is what I'm saying, and it's clear that many of you can supply that. And of course, the outcome of such an approach would be a well-written essay, which was quite well organized and was conceptually strong. And I mean, if you could do that, it would mean that, I mean, you're toward the end of your university career, you could write at that level, is really what I'm getting at. And in terms of getting a university education and what you're here for, that would be a real, you could say, this is a real accomplishment. I can do this again. I can do it again and again. This is my level. And whatever you do later in life, people go into business, they go into government, they do all kinds of, they become writers, whatever. But you can do, if you do that kind of an essay, you're at that level. Are there any questions about the exam? Okay, so I want to resume the narrative, and what I'm going to do today is I'm going to continue what we've been doing, and I'm going to show you how the Tet Offensive was really the high point of the Vietnam War, and the consequences of it were that Washington had to change its strategy. It by no means gave up, but the policy of escalation was aborted, and the United States was forced to find a new policy. One feature of which was to de-escalate, to disengage on the ground. American forces from this point onwards began to be drawn down rather than increased on the ground. At the same time, this policy ultimately turned into the policy of Vietnamization, which was fully implemented by Nixon and Kissinger. And it basically called for the withdrawal of ground troops while the attempt was made to build up the South Vietnamese government, both its political capacity and its military capacity, and to support that was massive air power. That became the new American policy. It's a real turning point in the war. It doesn't signal the end because the United States um, remained almost to the end committed to the idea that they could create a stable, non-communist government in South Vietnam. And so the war, that was their intention, and the war dragged on. So this is the overall theme of the lecture. Well, I guess I'll pick up at the with the anti-war movement. I'm sort of repeating or elaborating a little bit on what I said last time. And I mentioned that the anti-war movement, which was really nothing in 1965, by 67 had become an enormous movement, 40% of the American population. And as I explained, it was divided into two parts. There were the liberals who said, oh, this is all a mistake. And the person who embodied that, I would say, was the brother of the dead president, John Kennedy. Remember, John Kennedy, in my lights, John Kennedy basically began the escalation. And I don't think, although the Kennedy legend says that he would have gotten out, I don't see why. Just because he was good looking, he would have gotten out. He was a convinced cold warrior and believed, like those who surrounded him. And so I think he would have done what Johnson did. That's my view. Admittedly, there were other views. All of this is very debated. There are 3,500 books at least in English on the Vietnam War. So there's a lot of debate. In any case, the liberals were like Robert Kennedy, who became the leading figure in terms of when Johnson resigned. It looked like he was going to become president. Sorry, he was going to become the standard bearer of the Democratic Party. Of course, he was assassinated, just like his brother. But he was of the liberal type. But the radicals, of which there were more and more, because people were so frustrated by what was happening that they were radicalized, especially the younger generation who were subject to the draft. They became more and more radical. And their view was, no, this is more serious than a mistake. It is, the mask is off. American imperialism is real. And the Vietnam War is not a mistake. It's a product of the internal forces within the United States, the class structure of the United States, the nature of the economy itself leads to this kind of imperialist expansion and war, and this is what the Vietnam War was about. Now, on the other side, I said there were the Hawks. There were the Does and there were the Hawks, 1/3 of the population, mainly Republicans, really. And these people, they were committed to the containment policy that the United States had pursued since 1945, since the onset of the Cold War. And some of them really wanted a military solution, including the invasion of North Vietnam and, if necessary, the dropping of atomic bombs on North Vietnam. I would say an important element, of course, the attitude of the working class in the United States. Well, the still majority at this time, I don't think it's true now, but back then, the majority of the working class in the United States, those who worked in factories and so on, were white people, were whites. And these people had benefited from the prosperity of the post-war years, and they were extremely patriotic. They didn't have access to the sophisticated media and so on. They were not at the university. And so they tended to be, and also they didn't like what they considered to be the lack of patriotism of the does in the population. They considered them to be wimps, etc. And so the working class, the white working class, tended to continue to support the war until later on. Later on, it became, I mean, no one was supporting the war, but we're talking about this critical point. The reason why the war did not go well, and that's the main reason why the attitude of the does ultimately prevailed. But also, the does were to be found in the universities, in the big cities, in the pages of opinion makers, the mainline journals. And as a result of that, over time, this attitude of the war is wrong, we've got to get out, tended to prevail. Now, also, I noted that from the elite universities, the first line universities, the attitude of peace, of the war was wrong, and so on, spread to the lesser universities all across. And there's between 4,000 and 5,000 universities and colleges in the United States. It's the second biggest institution in the United States after the military. So, so this was important. And I noted that the draft was, for young people, was scary. You likely would be drafted, if you were a male, you would likely have to serve, and likely you would end up in Vietnam. So this was scary. Your exemption from the draft lasted through your college years, but after that, you would to be called up. So a lot of the opposition was just very grounded in material reality. Now, in terms of the arguments that went on, the people who said the war was wrong, basically they harked back to the Geneva Agreement. They said that by no means was this an act of foreign aggression, as the Johnson administration claimed. The Geneva Agreement had divided one country at the 17th parallel, and that's what the issue was. It was as a result of American intervention that there was this arbitrary frontier established between North and South Vietnam. The second point was that the majority of the people were peasants. They were oppressed by the landlords, and the Diem and later the Two regime basically represented the landlords amongst other people. And why should we be supporting the landlords? That was the second point. And of course, finally, that the Two government was, like the Diem government, was essentially a dictatorship. It was, in fact, a military dictatorship. So the idea that you're defending democracy in Vietnam seemed to be an absurdity. So that was the sort of the basic setup of the does. And as I said, they gradually became predominant. And of course, for Johnson was a Democrat. He was a conservative Democrat, fundamentally. The conservative Democrats mainly came from the South and from the western part of the United States. Johnson came from Texas. But this was an important element of the Democratic Party, still is. But the majority of the Democrats came from the North, or from California and sort of Oregon and places like that. And they all turned completely against Johnson. They hated Johnson. Now, that's the overall we could say that's the overall situation. But particularly important is the Black population, and I want to review that and go a little bit deeper. Um, that the Black population was an important constituent in the Democratic Party. Um, and at first, as I explained, Martin Luther King and the other leaders of the civil rights movement, which had begun in the early 60s, they basically kept quiet about us. They tried to limit whatever they said. And as I explained last time, the reason for this was that in the face of the civil rights movement, which was turning into the Black Power movement, and in the wake of Kennedy's assassination, Johnson had launched a Great Society program, the War Against Poverty, and the Black population was benefiting very considerably from this. And so King and the other leaders, they didn't want to alienate Johnson, and so they kept quiet. But by 1965, the situation in the Black community had changed. This started out, the movement, the Black movement started out as a civil rights movement. The idea was sort of peaceful and passive resistance to segregation, and the goal was integration into the mainstream of American life. This is what King articulated, and it was the sort of Democratic Party, but even beyond the Democratic Party, this was very appealing. And so this was the initial sentiment in the Black community. But by 65, the situation had changed. The civil rights movement continued, especially in the South. And there was a certain success because the federal government passed all sorts of laws prohibiting segregation, in the workplace, in the schools, in restaurants, everywhere. And they did all sorts of things to sort of boost the Black population. But the impatience of people, particularly in the northern cities, the large, I would say the majority of Blacks did not live in the South anymore. They had migrated northward looking for work in the first part of the 20th century in the northern cities, the big manufacturing cities of the North. And there they lived in ghettos, the ghettos in Philadelphia, New York, Baltimore, Detroit, Chicago, etc., cut off from the rest of the population and deprived of basic services, unemployed, and suffering terribly in these ghettos. And it was there that the voices of Black power began to catch on. Black power. And this took the form, in the first place, of the Black Panthers. The Black Panthers, many of them, the leaders, had been to college or university. They read, they knew something about the world. They were young and militant, and they became Marxist revolutionaries, but in a Black sense. They ignored, for the most part, the white population, and they just spoke about the Black population knowing how to defend itself. The Black population needed organization, and they needed weapons in order to defend themselves against white oppression. And then there were the Black Muslims who were not so well educated, and they said similar things, but it was in the name of Islam. They, that the Black population had traditionally created its own Christianity, in the United States, which of course is fantastic. The culture of Black Christianity, the gospel singing, it's a distinctive form of Christianity, born of oppression. And it's interesting in its own right. Well, becoming a Muslim, basically, the people who became Muslims basically were separating themselves and saying, no, Christianity was imposed on us by the white missionaries and so on. We're going over to, we're going to become Muslims. It's in itself an act of defiance. And they were militant. Malcolm X, who was in this time the most militant of these Black leaders, he was to begin with a Muslim, and his rejection of the whites was absolute. And so the thing is that between 1965 and 1968, well, the Black Muslims and the Black Panthers may have had marginally something to do with it. The mass of the Black population living in these ghettos in the main cities, who were caught up in this sort of general propaganda. They might not have had a basic sense of or deep sense of ideology and so on, but they knew that they were oppressed. And so what you got between 65 and 68, actually continued, but I'm just mentioning these years, was vast insurrections in the cities. 130 to 140 cities saw major riots between 1965 and 1968. And these ghettos were on fire. And the first targets were the stores owned by the whites, the businesses owned by the white people, who, it was said, were exploiting the Black population. But of course, the flames consumed whole areas of the city and so on. And you could fly over the United States on a summer's nights and you would see on the horizon fire after fire. The cities were on fire as the planes moved through the night. Furthermore, and finally, both the Muslims and especially the Black Panthers openly identified with the Viet Cong, with the National Liberation Front. They said our true enemies are the white establishment in the United States, and they're doing to us here in the United States the same thing they're doing to the people of Vietnam. There was this, and indeed to the people of the Third World. And I would say that if you were to go to the Aboriginal population today in Canada, it should be said that the ones in the know, the educated ones, in terms of the Aboriginal movement in Canada, they draw the same conclusions. We have here, they say, in Canada, we have internal colonialism. The whites, especially the powerful whites, the mining companies, the banks, and so on, they want our land. And basically, they're the ones who are oppressing us. And they're doing the same thing to us, these people, as they're doing in Central America, in the Near East, in Africa. This is what Aboriginal people here in Canada are saying today. So there you are. Now, the pressure on Martin Luther King was enormous. He was he still continued to be the most important leader of the Black community in the United States. To keep silent on Vietnam was almost impossible. And so on the 4th of April, 1967, he made a major speech in which he denounced the Vietnam War. And he said, this is an indirect expression, that the war was a symptom of far deeper malady, sickness in the United States. He meant the internal violence, the racism, the social polarization, etc. And he concluded that in the name of anti-communism, I'm paraphrasing, the United States stood opposed to the rightful demands of oppressed people everywhere, seeking freedom and dignity. That's what Martin Luther King said. And he called on people to resist however they could. Well, Martin Luther's days were numbered. There was John Kennedy, there was Robert Kennedy, and then there was Martin Luther King. All of them were assassinated during this period. You can't believe the excitement, the terror of those days. Beyond Martin Luther King, it should be mentioned that one of the Black Muslims happened to be the heavyweight champion of the world, Muhammad Ali. I mentioned him already, but I just want to, there's a very brief clip of him basically saying, the Viet Cong are not my enemy. Here it is. Maybe it's not going to come up, for Christ's sake. I don't know whether you heard that, but it's powerful. You can, if you can't hear it, it's on YouTube. And he says, "You're my enemy, not the Viet Cong." And of course, it's not merely his words and so on. It's received on the television. Black people are seeing this. And of course, in Vietnam, they know that the majority of a disproportionate number of the people who are actually doing the fighting and taking the casualties are Black people, Black soldiers. And so this has a huge impact. Before this is finished, the Black soldiers are actually firing on white soldiers in Vietnam. That's what it comes down to. So that's what's happening. Now, Ali, of course, was responding to the fact that he had been drafted, ordered to report, and he refused. So he was stripped of his title and convicted of draft dodging, and he was sentenced to 5 years in jail. But ultimately, all of this was appealed. And after many years, his appeal was vindicated by the Supreme Court after opinion turned against the war. Ali was given his freedom, and he was allowed to fight again, but his best days were past. as a fighter. He was never as good as he was, say, in 1967 or 68. By 1971, 72, in boxing terms, he was an old man. So that's what happened to, and of course, ultimately, as a result of being knocked around, do not engage in boxing, people, because if you get hit in the head enough times, you get Alzheimer's. That's what happens, and so it's not good. And that's what happened to Ollie. Well, the effect of this anti-war movement, which was so manifold and so on, was, and I said last time that it was a kind of quasi-revolutionary situation. Quasi-revolution. Why do I say quasi? As quasi means sort of as if, because it could not have become a revolutionary situation. For a revolutionary situation to occur, in addition to this kind of ferment, and maybe some additional economic problems, you need usually revolutions occur in severe economic oppression or economic crisis. Just a second. Nothing like that was going on. And furthermore, you need to be organized. For a revolution to take place, you need organization. There has to be some instrument, agent, party, which organizes all the ferment into an actual serious political movement. And the thing is, all of this ferment, I mean, even when you look at the New Left and all, you know, the students, the SDS and so on, they were against organization. That organization meant Stalinism. It wasn't the American way. They didn't believe in sort of an organized politics, or at best, it was a kind of anarchism. And so I don't believe it could have ended in some sort of revolution. The thing is that the Johnson and those who surrounded him in the state and the forces of order, and particularly the CIA and the FBI, were deeply, deeply alarmed by all this. They were, in a way, terrified by it. They were increasingly isolated as a result of this. And the FBI developed a special program known as COINTELPRO, which was, whose specific purpose was basically to undermine the anti-war movement. And the CIA did likewise. The CIA, in theory, is not supposed to be involved in internal politics. The CIA is supposed to be involved in foreign politics. It's supposed to spy and carry on its activities abroad, but they were very active in the anti-war movement, and so against the anti-war movement. So this was the major sort of organized response of the Johnson administration and later Nixon. But the Johnson administration was ultimately, and the pro-war governments were ultimately isolated and undermined by the peace movement. And they admitted, there was, for example, Paul Warnke, who was one of the chief architects of this policy of escalation, admitted that the anti-war movements, in the end, strongly, I'm quoting, strongly affected general government sentiment, and made a major contribution to U.S. de-escalation. That what could they do? And perhaps the figure who stands out in this respect is McNamara, who was the major architect, as I've explained, and you're reading him. Well, McNamara fell apart. He had to quit in 1967 because he couldn't take it psychologically. And the more so because his son, he's living, of course, in a big mansion in Washington. His son, who became anti-war, was furious, wouldn't speak to him, and hid up in his room, upstairs in the bedroom, the son, and in the bedroom, wouldn't come down. Generational conflict, maybe you've experienced yourself in your own life. In any case, in the room, on one wall, there was an American flag turned upside down, and on the other flag, the other side of the room was a flag of the National Liberation Front. This is the Secretary of Defense of the United States. His son is a supporter of the National Liberation Front. And this is what happened. These people, they all have, the people who became involved in this, they became socially isolated, even from their families. The polls in 1967 said, the public opinion polls that were taken said, well, the Vietnam War was a mistake. It was a mistake. And so the majority was now saying it was a mistake. And I think the best in terms of the expression of public opinion in its confusion was one housewife who was interviewed in one of these polls said, I want to get out, but I don't want to give up. I want to get out, but I don't want to give up. You know, what is the politics of such a position? And of course, I partly am pointing to it because your essay, your final essay is, I posed the question, Vietnam, this is important in terms of your proceeding with this essay. I say the Vietnam War was a mistake. It's an open statement made. And what you need to do in the essay is to sort of you have to sort of explain the main line of the essay would be, why was it a mistake? Why does each author think it was a mistake? They all think it's a mistake, but in different ways. So that's very important in terms as an organizational point by which you sort of organize your work. Are there any questions about this particular statement? Okay. In any case, back in Vietnam, the North Vietnamese, the DRV and the National Liberation Front are watching what's going on in the United States. And of course, they're of course encouraged by what's happening. And they see, of course, that the divisions in the United States, and particularly the divisions amongst the political elites in the United States, the collapse of the consensus foreign policy. Since the beginning of the Cold War, the governments had always tried to sort of get overwhelming support for carrying on the Cold War. Well, this major theater, the ultimate theater of the Cold War, people, even at the highest levels, were hawks or does. They were fighting one another. There was division, internal division within the United States. And so it was in this context that the Tet Offensive, finally we come to the Tet Offensive, which broke out at the end of January, 30th of January, 1968, was initiated by the communists, taking advantage of the New Year's holiday. The Vietnamese New Year came on this day, the end of January, 30th. And there was a ceasefire, unofficial ceasefire called to celebrate this day. People were out celebrating. The communists suddenly launched a powerful offensive. The number of NLF troops raised from the peasantry, 85,000 troops attacked the major towns and cities of Vietnam. Of course, the capital, Saigon, but virtually every other main city and town. We could say a total of about 150 towns and cities came under attack by the NLF. And it was a surprise. As I've already explained, the American military, Westmoreland, thought yes, the communists are preparing an offensive, but it's going to come in and around the DMZ or up in the highlands, not in the well-guarded cities and so on. But this is a very important point because it wasn't really an attempt on the part of the NLF to seize the cities. And you should understand, the ultimate objective was basically to invade the cities and cause a general uprising of the urban population. And by this means, they thought this general uprising would sweep away the ARVN, would sweep away the government and overthrow the two government. That was the objective. But that was only one aspect of it. The other part, and this is missed, I think, by most people who think that Westmoreland was some sort of a fool, which is simply not true. No, already by the time you arrive at the beginning of January, it's not the NLF, it's the PAVN moving down the Ho Chi Minh Trail through Laos. They cross the border and they launch an attack on the Marine base at Khe Sanh. And here yeah, you can see this. Khe Sanh is located right here. This is Laos. This is the border of Laos. You see right here. And up here is the demilitarized zone, the 17th parallel. So Khe Sanh is right near the Laotian border. And you can see this is where the Ho Chi Minh Trail comes down. So Khe Sanh is in a major blocking position against the infiltration of PAVN troops. And it's heavily fortified by 6,000 Marines. And in and around it are a whole series of artillery bases to protect Khe Sanh. The Americans have established these outlying defenses, these artillery bases to provide support fire in case they're attacked. Well, the communist side, the PAVN, brings down 40,000 PAVN troops who begin to attack Khe Sanh simultaneously with the Tet offensive against the cities. So what I'm saying is that it's a twofold business. It's a two-pronged attack. And Westmoreland was, in a way, justified. I mean, he should have probably known that there was a possibility that the cities would be attacked. He made a mistake, but he made no mistake about the seriousness of the communist offensive against Khe Sanh, because they saw it like another Dien Bien Phu. If they could, with 40,000 troops, overrun Khe Sanh, they would inflict a major defeat on the US Marines and completely demoralize American military forces. So it wasn't merely the attack on the town. Simultaneously, you want to understand Tet, it's also this assault on Khe Sanh. And you can see that this is, well, in my estimate, and indeed even the estimate of the American military, this was a brilliant. They gave General Giap, after all of this ended, years later, General Giap was invited to the United States because the American military wanted to honor his brilliance. It was a very fine strategy. And so This was uh, it's not Westmoreland, to dismiss him, I don't think is right. Um, and so, of course, uh, we can say then that in the immediate, um, not only was Westmoreland right and ultimately using massive air power, the United States, Johnson ordered all-out attack to defend the Marines at Khe Sanh. He unleashed virtually all the B-52s the Americans had, and they bombed the hell out of these 40,000 troops and forced the communists to retreat. Khe Sanh was saved. Furthermore, the Americans and the ARVN on this occasion, they didn't disintegrate in the cities. They rallied, and after weeks and months, the communists were driven out. The population did not rise against the government or overthrow the regime. And as I've explained, the reason why basically was, although there were obviously supporters of the communists in the towns, the great majority were not supporters. They were beneficiaries of the aid, of the largesse of the Americans. A certain artificial prosperity existed in the towns. And even peasants who had supported, who did not support the communists and so on, who fled and were basically begging for a living in town. At least they could live. At least they had something. And so they tended not to be interested in this Tet offensive. And so the population didn't rise. ARVN fought back. The Americans, of course, backed them, and with massive firepower. And the regime did not fall. And so on this basis, then, even at the time, the US military and the administration said, well, we defeated the communists and so on. Of course, that was foolish and nonsense. But it is the basis of what is called revisionism. That is to say, there did emerge in the wake of the Vietnam War a school of conservative historiography that basically said, look, the communists were defeated, driven out. They were decimated. It's true. Although, yes, they were decimated. They lost. But by 1971, the communists had built back up their whole structure in the countryside. They recovered by 1971. But in 68, thousands of insurgents lost their lives in this fight. But it became the basis of this view, which still promoted, that no, if the United States had persisted, they could have won. That is what we call revisionism. But the main thing about Tet, and there are other factors as well, military, that we will be considering. The main thing about Tet was that Tet marked the end of the escalation of the war and the end of Lyndon Johnson. That was what Tet did. It ended this policy of escalation on the ground, and it put an end to the presidency of Lyndon Johnson. And we'll see how this operated in the next class.